My billionaire husband sat in the dark corner of our bedroom, sipping vintage whiskey, watching a stranger touch me. He treated me like a doll in his twisted games, thinking he controlled my every breath. But he didn't know that while he watched, I fell in love with the man he hired. We plotted to steal his $10 million super yacht and disappear forever. We thought we had the perfect escape plan. But we had absolutely no idea that my husband was tracking our every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The evening settled over the sprawling metropolis like a heavy, suffocating velvet curtain, concealing the grime of the streets while millions of artificial lights flickered to life in the distance. But inside our penthouse on the 40th floor, the illumination was dimmed and chemically perfect. I stood motionless before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, a mannequin in a glass box, allowing my husband to fasten the zipper of my dress, which was the color of a midnight sky. The expensive fabric slid over my skin with the friction of a second skin, ruthlessly accentuating every curve and hollow that Richard considered his exclusive property. At 30 years old, I was as flawless and cold as everything else in this house, from the polished Italian marble beneath my heels to the curated collection of modern art that hung on the walls like silent judges. I watched my own reflection with a detached curiosity, seeing a woman who looked less like a living creature and more like the crowning jewel in a billionaire's hoard. Richard stood directly behind me, his hands resting heavily on my bare shoulders, his touch possessing a clinical, dry coldness that seeped into my bones. He was not embracing me. He was inspecting me. He adjusted the symmetry of my hair, smoothed a microscopic wrinkle on the strap of my gown, and when our eyes finally met in the silvered glass, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of affection or approval, but a sign of quality assurance, the way a collector might appraise a statue before unveiling it to an audience. Tonight was his directorial debut, a project he had been orchestrating with meticulous cruelty for weeks. We were waiting for a guest. This man was not a friend, nor a business partner, but simply a third, a human prop brought in to satisfy Richard's voyeuristic hunger. He called it expanding our horizons, but I knew it for what it was, another intricate layer of his control, a way to simulate danger while remaining safely ensconced behind his wall of money. The melodic chime of the doorbell sliced through the thick, perfumed air of the living room, signaling that the performance was about to begin. Richard did not move immediately. He stood his ground, allowing the housekeeper to answer, establishing his dominance through the subtle power of waiting. A moment later, the double doors to the living room opened, and Dante stepped across the threshold. He was enormous. His presence seemed to physically displace the air in the room, making the vaulted ceilings feel suddenly lower. His dark skin created a stark, violent contrast against the sterile whiteness of our interior, and his broad shoulders looked as though they could push the walls apart. He moved with a natural predatory grace that had not been taught in finishing schools or boardrooms, a raw vitality that made the expensive furniture look fragile and ridiculous. Richard stepped forward to bridge the distance, extending his hand in a gesture of welcoming civility that felt entirely performative. I watched the interaction with a sudden sharp clarity that made my stomach turn. The contrast was painful to witness. Richard's hand, pale, manicured and dry, was engulfed by the massive, powerful palm of our guest. It was a collision of two different worlds, the artificial against the elemental. Richard smiled, his teeth gleaming in the low light, but his eyes remained flat and calculating, assessing the man before him not as a person, but as a tool he had rented for the evening. He was so confident in his ownership of the room, of the situation, and of me, that he failed to notice the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden charge of static electricity that pricked at the skin. Dante did not look at the floor or at the expensive art. He looked over Richard's shoulder, his gaze locking directly onto mine with a terrifying precision. In that look, there was none of the greasy, appraising lust I had conditioned myself to expect from Richard's associates. Instead, there was a calm, abyssal strength, a recognition that stripped away the couture dress and the title of wife, leaving me feeling exposed and breathless. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a warning signal that went unheeded. Richard turned back to me, his smile widening, completely oblivious to the fact that in his arrogance, he had just invited a wildfire into his paper house. He thought he was starting a game he could control, never suspecting that the spark had already landed, and everything he owned was about to burn. The atmosphere inside the master bedroom had thickened into something almost viscous, a heavy, suffocating air that clung to the skin like a damp sheet. The room was saturated with the cloying, sweet smoke of sandalwood incense, a scent Richard preferred because he believed it masked the scent of our own humanity, replacing the raw smells of sweat and sex with something curated and expensive. He sat in the far corner of the room, ensconced in his high-backed leather armchair like a monarch on a throne, swilling a glass of amber whiskey with a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. He had positioned himself perfectly within the shadows, retreating into the role of the observer, the supreme judge of the proceedings he had orchestrated. The lighting was dim, strategically arranged to highlight the center of the room while leaving him in obscurity, turning the space into a private theater where he was the sole audience member. I could feel his eyes on me, cold and precise, stripping away my agency layer by layer until I felt less like a wife and more like a mechanism he had wound up and set in motion. The silence in the room was not peaceful. It was a pressurized vacuum, waiting for the spark that would ignite the oxygen. Richard finally gave the signal, a gesture so subtle that anyone who didn't know him would have missed it entirely. A slight, languid tilt of his crystal glass toward the bed, accompanied by a narrowing of his eyes. It was the director calling action, the permission to begin the performance he had scripted in his mind. I took a breath that shuddered in my lungs and began to walk toward Dante, who stood waiting in the center of the Persian rug. With every step, I felt the phantom weight of Richard's gaze drilling into my spine, a sensation that was physically painful. I had been given my stage directions earlier that evening over a glass of dry white wine. I was to be the submissive, eager doll, the bored socialite craving a thrill, the perfect accessory to his fantasy. I was supposed to perform pleasure, to enact a scene of debauchery that would validate Richard's power and his generosity in sharing me. My movements were stiff at first, rehearsed, the walk of a woman who is conscious of her angles and the way the light hits the silk of her lingerie. I was walking through molasses, fighting the urge to run, fighting the crushing humiliation of being traded like a commodity in my own home. But then I reached him. Dante was standing perfectly still, not posturing, not acting, just existing with a gravity that seemed to anchor the room. When I stepped into his personal space, the air temperature seemed to rise by 10 degrees. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, to touch his chest, expecting the same performative rigidity I felt in myself. Instead, the moment my fingertips grazed his skin, the script I had memorized disintegrated into ash. His skin was burning. It radiated a dry, intense heat that was shocking in its immediacy, a biological reality that shattered the artificial coolness of the penthouse. This was not the dry, papery skin of my husband. This was living, breathing vitality. He didn't wait for me to continue my tentative exploration. He reached out and took my waist in his hands. His grip was not the pinching, possessive hold of a man claiming ownership. It was a solid, grounding force. His hands were large, rough with calluses that snagged against the silk of my slip, and they held me with a firmness that was both demanding and strangely protective. In that split second of contact, the room spun, and the carefully constructed facade of the evening cracked down the center. The contrast between the two men was so violent it made me dizzy. For 10 years I had been touched by Richard's manicured hands, hands that were always cool, always precise, moving over my body with the clinical detachment of a doctor or an appraiser. Richard touched me to verify my value, to ensure I was maintained, to extract his due. But Dante touched me as if he were starving. As he pulled me flesh against him, I could feel the thudding of his heart against my own, a powerful erratic rhythm that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with desire. He wasn't playing a role. He wasn't performing for the man in the corner. He was looking down at me, his dark eyes dilated and intense, seeing me. Not the dress, not the price tag, not the husband watching from the shadows. He saw the woman trembling inside the couture. It was a revelation that stripped the air from my lungs. The realization that I was being perceived as a human being, rather than a prop, was so overwhelming that I almost sobbed. When he lowered his head and covered my mouth with his, the world outside the circle of his arms ceased to exist. It wasn't a kiss meant for an audience. It was a collision. It was wet and hot and desperate. A chaotic dialogue of tongues and breath that bypassed my brain and spoke directly to the starving animal inside me. I forgot the script. I forgot the lighting. I forgot the billionaire sitting 10 feet away with his whiskey. I melted into Dante, my body betraying me in the most beautiful way possible. I wasn't acting anymore. I wrapped my arms around his neck, burying my hands in the short, coarse hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer, needing to absorb his strength. The sounds that escaped my throat, low guttural whimpers of need, were not the polite theatrical moans Richard expected. They were raw, ugly, honest sounds that had been buried under layers of etiquette and repression for a decade. I was drowning in the sensation of him, in the taste of him, in the sheer, undeniable reality of a man who wanted me simply because I was there, not because he owned me. Dante moved with a power that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He didn't ask for permission. He took control with a natural dominance that made Richard's calculated games look pathetic. He lifted me effortlessly, his muscles coiling and releasing like steel cables beneath his skin, and the sensation of being handled with such raw strength made my head swim. Every touch was a shock to my system, waking up nerves that had been dormant for years. I felt the roughness of his stubble against my neck, the weight of his body pressing me down, the friction of skin on skin. It was messy and unchoreographed, a frantic scramble for connection that felt like a fight for survival. We were two people drowning in a sea of artificiality, clinging to each other as the only real things in the room. The scent of him, musk, rain and warm skin, filled my senses, drowning out the cloying sandalwood incense, replacing the smell of the theater with the smell of life. In the midst of this storm of sensation, a sudden sharp instinct made me open my eyes. I don't know why I did it, perhaps a lingering habit of checking for approval, perhaps a need to ground myself in the room. My gaze flew over Dante's shoulder, through the dim light, and locked onto the figure in the corner. Richard was still sitting there motionless. He hadn't moved a muscle. He was leaning forward slightly, his elbows on the armrests, the glass of whiskey suspended near his lips. His expression was not one of jealousy, nor of anger, nor even of passion. It was a look of cold, anatomical interest. His eyes were narrowed, scanning the interaction of our bodies with the same detached calculation he used when looking at a spreadsheet or a racehorse. A faint, satisfied half-smile played on his lips, the smile of a voyeur who has gotten exactly what he paid for. He wasn't participating in the act, he was consuming it. To him, my pleasure was just another product he had manufactured, a scene he was directing from the safety of his chair. That smile broke something inside me. It wasn't a heartbreak, it was a snapping of a tether. In that second, staring into the dead, shark-like eyes of my husband while I lay in the arms of a stranger, a wave of pure, molten hatred rose up in my chest. It was a feeling so intense, so violent, that it almost made me gag. I realized with a crystalline, horrifying clarity that he felt absolutely nothing for me. I wasn't his wife. I was his favorite toy, a doll he lent out to see how it would bend. He didn't care about my pleasure. He cared about his own power. He enjoyed seeing me degraded, enjoyed seeing me serviced by another man, because it confirmed that he was the master of the house, the puppet master who pulled the strings. The love I thought we had, the partnership I had told myself existed, was a lie. I was a prop in his perversion, a beautiful object to be used to reflect his own ego back at him. The hatred was clarifying. It burned away the guilt, the shame and the fear. I tore my eyes away from the cold figure in the chair and looked back at Dante. He was hovering over me, his face flushed, his eyes dark with a mixture of lust and concern, sensing the shift in my tension. He wasn't using me. He was with me. In this bizarre, twisted scenario, the stranger was the only one treating me with dignity. He was the only one who was risking something, the only one who was present. The realization transformed the act. It was no longer a performance for Richard. It was a rebellion against him. I reached up and pulled Dante down to me with a ferocity that surprised us both. I kissed him not to show off, but to erase the image of my husband from my mind. I wanted to be consumed by this man, to be covered by his shadow until the rest of the room disappeared. My hands roamed over Dante's back, tracing the ridges of his spine, feeling the sweat slicking his skin. I wanted to memorize the texture of him, to imprint this reality onto my soul, so that I would never again be fooled by the cold, polished surface of my life with Richard. Every thrust, every gasp, every drop of sweat was a declaration of war. I was taking what was mine. I was stealing pleasure that Richard thought he had dispensed, and I was making it my own. I clung to Dante like a lifeline, my nails digging into his shoulders, using his body as a shield against the cold void of the penthouse. For the first time in my life, lying on that expensive mattress under the gaze of a billionaire, I didn't feel like a possession. I felt dangerous. I felt alive. And as the heat between us built to a crescendo, I knew that when this night was over, nothing in this house would ever be the same again. The doll was broken, and the woman who was waking up inside the porcelain shell was angry, desperate, and ready to burn the theater to the ground. After that night, the tectonic plates of my reality shifted, creating a fissure so deep and wide that my life effectively split into two distinct, irreconcilable continents. By day, I remained the porcelain doll in the glass cabinet, the perfect wife who drifted through the high-ceilinged rooms of the penthouse with a smile painted on her face. I discussed the seasonal menu with the private chef, debating the merits of truffle oil versus saffron foam. I stood in climate-controlled art galleries, nodding thoughtfully at abstract sculptures that looked like twisted car wrecks, sipping warm champagne and making polite conversation with women who had more Botox than blood in their veins. To the outside world, and especially to Richard, nothing had changed. In fact, if anything, I was more docile, more attentive, performing my duties with a terrifying, glassy-eyed perfection. But inside, behind the mask of foundation and social grace, a chaotic storm was brewing. My thoughts were never in the room. They were miles away, tracking the movement of a shadow across the city, remembering the weight of a hand that felt like salvation, replaying the memory of a voice that didn't command, but asked. Richard, in his supreme arrogance, was delighted with the progress we had made. He walked around the apartment with the swagger of a man who has successfully broken a wild horse, believing that the experiment with the third had achieved exactly what he intended. It had bound me closer to him through mutual depravity. He thought he had corrupted me, made me a co-conspirator in his vices, and that the shame of what we had done, or what he had watched, would act as a leash, keeping me heel to toe with his desires. He even went so far as to encourage my friendship with Dante, dropping casual, sickening remarks about how good it was for me to have a distraction, to have a pet to play with. He believed he was the puppeteer, holding all the strings, pulling Dante into our orbit when he was bored and pushing him away when he was done. He thought he controlled the narrative, unaware that the characters had started writing their own lines the moment he looked away. He mistook my silence for submission, never suspecting that it was actually the quiet concentration of a prisoner memorizing the guard's rotation. But Richard was fatally wrong. The dynamic had shifted the moment Dante looked at me with recognition instead of lust. Our connection, birthed in the perverse theater of my husband's bedroom, quickly spilled out of the container he had built for it. We began to meet in the blind spots of the city, in the corners of the metropolis where Richard's influence, and his surveillance, did not reach. The penthouse bedroom was replaced by the vinyl booths of 24-hour diners on the edge of Queens, where the coffee tasted like battery acid and the neon signs buzzed like angry hornets. We met on park benches in the shivering cold, huddled together under a single umbrella, watching pigeons fight over crumbs. We met in the back seats of anonymous yellow taxis that circled the block for an hour, the meter ticking away the minutes of our freedom. In these spaces, stripped of the luxury that usually suffocated me, there was no Richard. There was no performance. There was only the raw, terrifying honesty of two people who had found each other in the wreckage. I quickly learned that Dante was far more than the silent, physical specimen Richard had hired to decorate his bedroom. He was not just a body. He was a mind sharp and observant, tempered by a life that had been as hard as mine had been soft. He saw things. He saw the way I flinched when a door slammed. He saw the way I checked my phone with a spasm of anxiety every 10 minutes. He saw the hollow look in my eyes when I talked about my perfect life. He was deeply intelligent, possessing a quiet, soulful wisdom that made Richard's manicured intellect seem brittle and shallow. We talked for hours, whispering over cold fries or while walking along the grimy waterfront. I found myself pouring out secrets I had never told a living soul. I told him about the suffocating control Richard exerted, how he monitored my credit card statements down to the penny, how he chose my clothes, my friends, and my hobbies. I told him about the loneliness that felt like a physical weight in my chest, a black hole that swallowed all light. Dante listened. He didn't interrupt, he didn't offer cheap platitudes, and he didn't judge. He sat across from me, his large hands resting on the table, often clenching into fists as I described the subtle psychological torture of my marriage. I could see the muscles in his jaw working, a physical manifestation of the anger he felt on my behalf. It was intoxicating to be defended, even silently. For the first time, I wasn't being managed or critiqued, I was being heard. He treated my pain with reverence, validating the reality I had begun to doubt. He told me about his own life, about the struggles and the losses, about the family he had lost and the few he had left. We built a world in those stolen hours, a fragile, invisible cathedral of intimacy that existed parallel to the glass prison of the penthouse. I realized I was falling in love with him, not for the way he touched me, though that memory burned bright, but for the way he looked at me when I was speaking, as if my voice was the only sound in the world that mattered. The turning point came on a Tuesday night in late November. The city was being lashed by a torrential downpour, a cold, relentless rain that turned the streets into rivers of oil and light. We were sitting in Dante's car, an old, battered sedan parked in the shadow of a bridge, the heater struggling to keep the condensation off the windows. The rhythm of the rain drumming on the roof was deafening, enclosing us in a private, watery capsule. I was crying quietly, exhausted by a fight I had had with Richard earlier that evening over something trivial, a misplaced coaster, a tone of voice he didn't like. I felt broken, stripped of the last vestiges of my resilience. I told Dante that I couldn't do it anymore, that I felt like I was disappearing, fading into the wallpaper of the penthouse. I told him I was afraid I would die in that house, not from violence, but from the sheer crushing weight of being nothing. Dante turned to me in the dark car, the dashboard lights casting his face in a green ghostly glow. He reached out and took my face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears that tracked down my cheeks. "I won't let you disappear, Claire," he said, his voice low and fierce, vibrating with a conviction that stopped my breath. "I'm not going to be his secret anymore. And neither are you. I want to take you away from him. I want to take you away from all of this." It was a moment of insanity. The words hung in the air, impossible and dangerous. A rundown car, a few $100s in cash between us, and the wrath of a billionaire husband. It was a recipe for disaster. But Dante didn't stop there. He didn't just offer a dream, he offered a plan. A plan born of desperation and the specific, unique opportunities that Richard's arrogance had provided us. He shifted in his seat, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned through the gloom. "The yacht," he whispered. "The siren." I froze. Richard's new toy. A 70-foot masterpiece of Italian engineering, sleek, fast, and aggressively expensive. It had just come out of the dry dock after a month of retrofitting and repairs. Richard had been bragging about it for weeks, talking about the upgraded engines, the extended fuel tanks, the state-of-the-art navigation systems. It was sitting in the marina right now, fully fueled, stocked for the upcoming season, waiting for the weekend when Richard planned to show it off to his business partners. It was a floating fortress, a symbol of Richard's immense wealth and reach, and Dante was suggesting we turn it into our getaway car. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. To use the very symbol of his status to escape him, it was poetic justice. "Think about it, Claire," Dante urged, his hands moving to grip my shoulders, grounding me in the reality of the proposal. "It's fast. Faster than anything the Coast Guard patrols with on a standard night. It has the range to get us to international waters before he even wakes up to realize you're gone. We head south. Not to the usual ports. We go deep." He outlined the route with a terrifying specificity. We would push the engines to the limit, running dark, bypassing the coastal tracking stations. We would head for the islands where Dante had distant cousins, a network of kin who lived off the grid, people who knew how to make ghosts disappear. We would sell the boat for parts in a jurisdiction that didn't ask questions, or scuttle it and vanish into the local population. It was madness. It was piracy. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I looked past him, out the foggy window at the rain sluicing down the glass, distorting the lights of the city into blurry streaks of red and gold. I thought of the penthouse, the cold marble floors, the way Richard looked at me like I was a piece of furniture he might upgrade next year. I thought of the years stretching out ahead of me, a long gray corridor of obedience and silence. And then I looked at Dante. I saw the fear in his eyes. He knew the risk he was taking, knew that a black man stealing a billionaire's wife and his yacht would be hunted to the ends of the earth. But beneath the fear, I saw a wild, unshakable hope. He was willing to burn his life down to save mine. For the first time in 10 years, the future wasn't a blank wall. It was a horizon. It was open water. It was dangerous and terrifying and unknown, but it was mine. I turned back to him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and nodded. In the silence of that car, beneath the roar of the storm, I chose the abyss. I chose the freedom of the fall. I chose him. The weeks leading up to our departure transformed my life into a razor-edged performance of domestic espionage, played out entirely within the suffocating velvet confines of the penthouse. Living under the same roof as Richard while plotting to destroy him required a level of dissociation I had not known I possessed. I became an actress in my own home, smiling over morning coffee while my mind catalogued the contents of the wall safe. The preparation for our escape did not happen in the shadows, but in the blinding light of our daily routine, which gave every action the terrifying thrill of a blade pressed against the skin. I began siphoning money with the patience of a spider spinning a web, making small, irregular cash withdrawals from the household accounts that I hoped would vanish into the noise of our exorbitant monthly expenses. I raided my own jewelry box, selecting pieces not for their sentimental value, of which they had none, but for the weight of their stones and the liquidity of their gold. I tucked diamond earrings into the lining of my purse and hid a ruby brooch inside a box of tampons, turning the mundane artifacts of my life into a smuggler's cache, all while Richard sat across the room, reading his financial reports and sipping his scotch. The nerve center of my operation was, ironically, Richard's own study, the one room in the house where his presence felt most oppressive even when he was absent. He had been shockingly careless with the navigation charts for the Siren, leaving them rolled out on his mahogany desk like a treasure map inviting theft. I spent hours in there while he was at the office, tracing the blue lines of the bathymetric charts with a trembling finger, memorizing the depths of the channels and the locations of the coastal buoys. I calculated fuel consumption rates and travel times to the international limit, converting nautical miles into hours of freedom. The smell of his cigar smoke, stale and clinging to the leather books, made me nauseous, a constant olfactory reminder of the monster I was fleeing. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway sent a spike of adrenaline through my veins that nearly stopped my heart, but the fear was a powerful stimulant. I felt smarter than him for the first time in our marriage, intoxicated by the belief that his arrogance had finally made him blind to the threat sitting in his own chair. However, Richard's behavior began to shift in a way that was far more unsettling than his usual cold indifference or controlling scrutiny. He became generous, exhibiting a terrifying performative kindness that felt like the petting of a dog before it is put down. He started coming home early, bringing gifts wrapped in heavy silver paper, his eyes tracking my reactions with a predator's unblinking focus. 2 days before our planned departure, he presented me with a velvet box containing a diamond necklace of such ostentatious weight it felt like a shackle when he fastened it around my throat. His fingers lingered on the clasp at the nape of my neck for a second too long, his breath warm against my skin as he whispered that I was his most priceless possession. It was a statement of ownership masquerading as a compliment, and it made my skin crawl. The air in the penthouse grew heavy with an unspoken tension, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up whenever he entered the room. I felt like a mouse being batted between the paws of a cat that has not yet decided when to bite. Then came the offer that solidified the timeline of our destruction. Over a dinner of seared scallops that I could barely swallow, Richard suggested we take the Siren out for the weekend. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine, and proposed a shakedown cruise to inaugurate the season, just the two of us alone on the water. My heart hammered against my ribs, threatening to fracture the bone. It was the opening I had been praying for, handed to me on a silver platter. Yet the coincidence was so perfect it tasted like a trap. I forced myself to smile, masking my terror with a mask of delighted surprise. I reached across the table and took his hand, playing the role of the devoted wife one last time. I told him it was a wonderful idea, But I added a twist of my own invention. I insisted on going to the marina on Friday afternoon, hours before him, claiming I wanted to prepare a romantic surprise dinner on board so everything would be perfect when he arrived. I watched his face closely, searching for a flicker of suspicion, but his expression remained smooth and unreadable. Richard agreed to my plan with a slow, deliberate nod, a smile spreading across his face that didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile I had never seen before, cryptic, satisfied, and chillingly devoid of warmth. A surprise, he repeated softly, testing the word as if it had a double meaning only he understood. That sounds exactly like something you would do, Claire. Go ahead. Make the boat ready for me. The way he said it, with a strange emphasis on the final words, sent a shiver of pure ice down my spine. It felt as if he wasn't agreeing to a dinner, but to an inevitable conclusion he had already foreseen. I withdrew my hand, feeling a sudden urge to wash the skin where he had touched me. Later that night, lying awake beside his sleeping form, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I was outsmarting a tyrant or walking willingly into a grave he had dug for me. But the momentum of the escape was already a physical force. I was moving too fast to stop, driven by the desperate hope that his smile was just arrogance, not omniscience. 24 hours before the end of my life as I knew it, I met Dante for the last time on solid ground. We chose a dilapidated motel on the edge of the industrial district, a place where the neon sign buzzed with a dying insect sound, and the air smelled of diesel fumes and desperation. It was a stark, ugly contrast to the pristine world I was leaving, but to me it felt like a sanctuary. I parked my car 3 blocks away and walked through the rain, pulling my collar up to hide my face, terrified that Richard's eyes were watching from every shadow. When Dante opened the door to room 24, the relief that washed over me was so intense it nearly buckled my knees. He pulled me inside, locking the world out, and for a moment we just stood there, dripping wet and shaking, holding on to each other as if we were the only 2 solid things in a universe of liquid chaos. He looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red, but there was a fire in them that burned through the fatigue. Dante had spent the day at the marina, using his cover as a casual laborer to gain access to the siren. He spoke in a rush, his voice low and urgent, detailing the technical preparations that would ensure our survival. He had checked the twin diesels, ensuring they were primed and running smooth. He had topped off the fuel tanks to capacity, giving us the range to reach the islands without stopping. He confirmed that the navigation system was updated, and crucially, that he had located the transponder Richard used to track the vessel. He hadn't disabled it yet. That would raise an alarm on Richard's phone, but he showed me the wire he would cut the moment we cleared the breakwater. Listening to him speak with such competence and certainty, I felt the knot of anxiety in my chest begin to loosen. He wasn't just a lover. He was a partner, a man of action who was dismantling the cage bar by bar. He had thought of everything, from the tides to the satellite coverage, turning our romantic flight into a military operation. We spent the rest of the afternoon in that dingy room, engaged in a lovemaking that was frantic, heavy, and tinged with the metallic taste of fear. There was no gentleness in us that day. We touched each other with a desperate, bruising intensity, trying to fuse our bodies together before the leap into the void. It felt like a farewell to the people we had been, the bored wife and the secret lover, and a violent baptism for the fugitives we were about to become. I clung to his shoulders, burying my face in his neck, inhaling the scent of him to drown out the memory of Richard's cologne. Every kiss felt like a vow, a promise that the risk was worth the reward. We were breathing the same air, sharing the same terrifying secret, suspended in a bubble of time that was rapidly running out. As the light outside began to fade into a bruised purple twilight, I pulled back to look at him, the fear I had been suppressing finally bubbling to the surface. "He knows," I whispered, the words trembling in the quiet room. "I feel it, Dante. Richard is too calm. He's too happy. What if he lets us go just to hunt us down?" The memory of Richard's reptilian smile in the dining room haunted me, a ghost I couldn't exorcise. Dante silenced me with a kiss, his hands framing my face with a strength that felt unbreakable. "He doesn't know anything," he promised, his forehead resting against mine. "He's arrogant. He thinks he owns you so completely that you'd never dare to leave. Tomorrow night we disappear. 24 hours, Claire. Just 24 hours, and he becomes a ghost story we tell each other to laugh at. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the dread pooling in my stomach was just nerves, not a premonition. I nodded, holding on to his promise like a lifeline, unaware that the ghost story had already begun, and we were not the ones writing the ending. The evening of our escape descended upon the city not with a cooling breeze, but with a suffocating blanket-like stillness that trapped the heat of the day against the pavement. The air was heavy and motionless, a physical weight that pressed against my skin, saturated with the briny metallic scent of the harbor and the exhaust fumes of a million idling cars. The marina, usually a bustling playground for the idle rich, was submerged in a profound velvety darkness, abandoned by the weekend sailors who had retreated to their air-conditioned clubs. Only the occasional security light pierced the gloom, casting long, distorted reflections that danced like oil slicks on the black, oily surface of the water. I walked down the long wooden pier, clutching the strap of my leather overnight bag so tightly that my fingers had gone numb. Inside that bag lay the sum total of my existence. Stacks of cash bound in rubber bands, my passport, and the stolen jewelry that would fund our new life in the islands. Every step I took felt like a thunderclap. The sharp staccato click of my heels on the weathered planks echoed in the silence, a rhythmic announcement of my treason that I was terrified would wake the sleeping giants in the yachts around me. I kept my head down, hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat, my eyes darting frantically between the shadows and the distant gatehouse. The security guard was a creature of habit, usually asleep by 11, but tonight my paranoia transformed every rustle of the wind and every creak of a mooring line into the sound of an approaching siren. The humidity was oppressive, causing my silk blouse to cling uncomfortably to my back, a sensation that felt like a cold sweat despite the warmth of the night. I felt exposed, a target painted in the crosshairs of an invisible rifle, walking a tightrope over an abyss of black water. Looming ahead at the end of the dock was the siren, rising from the dark water like a white ghost. She was magnificent and terrifying, a 70-foot dagger of fiberglass and chrome that Richard had purchased to assert his dominance over the ocean. Tonight she looked less like a pleasure craft and more like a getaway vehicle, her sleek lines promising a speed that could outrun my past. She bobbed gently in the slip, the water lapping against her hull with a soft, conspiratorial whisper, waiting to carry me away from the man who had named her. Dante was already there. I saw his silhouette detach itself from the shadows of the aft deck as I approached, a darker shape against the night sky. He didn't wave or call out. He simply moved to the gunwale, extending a hand toward me. I passed him the heavy bag first, watching as he swung it effortlessly over the rail, then I reached up. His hand closed around mine, and the contact was electric, warm, calloused, and infinitely reliable. He pulled me up from the dock, and for a split second, I was suspended over the black gap between the land and the boat, between my old life and my new one. When my feet touched the teak deck, I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. He pulled me into a brief, hard embrace, his arms forming a protective cage around me. He smelled of diesel fuel and sea salt, a rough, masculine scent that grounded me in the reality of the moment. "We're good," he whispered against my hair, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in his chest. "Engine checks are done. Lines are singled up. We go now." We moved across the deck like intruders, keeping our bodies low and avoiding the patches of light thrown by the dock lamps. We didn't turn on the deck lights or the navigation beacons. We were a ghost ship, seeking to slip the surly bonds of the marina unnoticed. Dante guided me to the cockpit, his movements sure and practiced, born of the hours he had spent studying the manuals I had stolen. He slid into the captain's chair and began to flip the toggle switches on the control panel, his face illuminated only by the faint, green glow of the instrument gauges. I stood beside him, gripping the back of the leather seat, watching his hands dance across the controls. He looked transformed, no longer the hired muscle or the secret lover, but a captain commanding his vessel. He turned the key, and the twin diesel engines beneath our feet roared to life. It wasn't a loud noise. The siren was too expensive for that, but a deep guttural thrum that vibrated through the hull and traveled up through the soles of my shoes, settling in my stomach as a tremble of pure anticipation. Dante engaged the thrusters, and the boat began to slide away from the dock, the movement smooth and inevitable. I looked back, unable to resist the urge to see what I was leaving behind. The city skyline rose up like a wall of diamonds, a glittering, jagged monument to money and power. I could see the distinct outline of the building where we lived, the penthouse perched on top like an eagle's nest. From this distance it looked beautiful and serene, a golden cage that I had polished for 10 years. But as I stared at the shore, a trick of the light or a projection of my own terrified mind played a cruel game on me. I thought I saw a figure standing at the end of the pier we had just left, a solitary, motionless silhouette in a dark suit, watching us drift away. My heart stopped. I gripped Dante's shoulder, my nails digging into his shirt. "Dante," I hissed, pointing a trembling finger. "Is that him? Is he there?" Dante glanced back, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness of the receding dock. He looked for a long moment, then shook his head, his hand covering mine on his shoulder. "It's a piling, Claire. Or a shadow. There's no one there. He's at the club, remember? Pouring scotch and bragging about his new boat. He doesn't know." He turned his focus back to the water, steering us carefully through the maze of moored yachts. "Don't look back," he commanded softly. "It's just ghosts. We're leaving them all behind." I forced myself to exhale, blinking the image away. He was right. It was just a shadow, a manifestation of the guilt and fear that had been my constant companions for so long. Richard was miles away, safe in his arrogance, believing I was at home waiting for him. I turned my face forward, toward the open mouth of the harbor, where the breakwater gave way to the endless black expanse of the Atlantic. As we cleared the no-wake zone, Dante pushed the throttles forward. The siren responded instantly, the bow lifting out of the water as the engine surged with a massive infusion of power. The low hum transformed into a powerful roar, the sound of thousands of horsepower being unleashed. We picked up speed, the hull slicing through the choppy water of the channel, throwing up a spray that glittered like crushed diamonds in the moonlight. The wind hit us then, no longer the stagnant, stifling air of the city, but a clean, cold gale that smelled of deep water and infinite space. It whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes and filling my lungs with oxygen. Felt like a baptism. It stripped away the scent of the penthouse, the smell of fear, the suffocating perfume of my old life. I closed my eyes and leaned into the wind, letting it scour me clean. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, a strange jagged sound that surprised me. It started as a giggle of disbelief and quickly escalated into a full-throated laugh of hysterical relief. We were doing it. We were actually doing it. I looked at Dante, his profile sharp against the glowing instruments, a grin spreading across his face as he felt the power of the boat beneath his hands. I reached out and touched his cheek, shouting over the roar of the wind and the engines. "We're free!" I screamed, the words torn away by the slipstream. "Dante, we're free!" He looked at me, his eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and adoration, and nodded. He pulled me closer, wrapping one arm around my waist while he steered with the other, anchoring me to him. For the first time in years, the crushing weight that had sat on my chest, the granite slab of Richard's expectations, his control, his coldness, was gone. I felt weightless, buoyant, as if I could fly off the deck and soar into the night. The city began to shrink behind us, the towering skyscrapers reducing to toy blocks, the millions of lights merging into a single, glowing haze on the horizon. The landmarks of my captivity, the office tower where Richard worked, the restaurant where we had our anniversary dinners, the bridge I used to stare at from my window, all of it was fading, losing its definition and its power over me. They were just lights now, distant stars in a galaxy I no longer inhabited. We were moving faster now, the speedometer climbing as we hit the open ocean, the rhythmic pounding of the hull against the waves becoming the heartbeat of our new existence. I stood by the rail, watching the wake churn white and frothy behind us, a road that was erasing itself as we traveled. I felt a profound sense of victory. We had outsmarted the smartest man in the room. We had stolen his prize and used it to escape his prison. The darkness of the ocean swallowed us, a protective cloak that felt infinitely safer than the lights of the city. There was no one out here but us, the wind, and the water. I looked up at the sky, where the real stars were beginning to break through the haze, sharp and bright and indifferent. I imagined the morning, waking up in the islands, the sun on my face, Dante beside me. Richard a distant memory and a lawyer's problem. I imagined a life where I made my own choices, where I wasn't watched, where I wasn't measured. The euphoria was dizzying, a drug more potent than any wine. I leaned my head on Dante's shoulder, listening to the powerful drone of the engines that were carrying us away, unaware that the vibration beneath my feet was not the hum of freedom, but the ticking of a clock that had almost run out of time. I watched the shore disappear completely, the last connection to my husband severed, and for the first time in a decade, I allowed myself to believe in a happy ending. Richard stood on the limestone balcony of the penthouse, 60 stories above the pavement, holding a glass of Louis XIII cognac in one hand and his smartphone in the other. The wind-up here was constant and biting, a cold stream of air that whipped the hem of his silk dressing gown around his legs, but he did not step back inside. He was not looking at the view, though it was arguably the most expensive view in the city. He was not looking at the ocean, which was nothing more than a vast, impenetrable void of black ink stretching out beyond the harbor lights. His entire world, his entire focus was distilled down to the small glowing screen in his palm. A single blue dot was pulsing rhythmically against the digital map of the Atlantic coastline, moving with a steady, determined speed away from the shore. It was the GPS tracker hardwired into the hull of the Siren, a redundant system he had installed under the guise of anti-theft security. To him it looked like a heartbeat, a mechanical digital pulse that represented the lives of the two people who believed they had outsmarted him. He watched it cross the invisible line that marked the end of the territorial waters, moving into the lawless silence of the open ocean. He took a slow, savoring sip of the cognac, letting the 70-year-old liquid burn pleasantly in his throat. It was time. The narrative they had constructed for themselves was almost touching in its banality. They believed he was the oblivious husband, the aging billionaire blinded by arrogance, sitting in his club with a cigar while they stole his property and his dignity. The truth, however, was far more clinical. Richard was not a jealous husband. Jealousy implies a fear of loss, and one cannot lose what one truly owns. He was a pragmatic businessman, and he had been auditing this relationship from its inception. He knew about every stolen glance, every brushed hand, every breathless meeting in those sordid roadside diners. He had read every encrypted text message Claire sent, thanks to the keystroke logger on her phone. He had listened to the audio recordings from the bugs in the bedroom and the car, hearing them whisper their treasonous plans while he sat in his office reviewing spreadsheets. He had watched their great love bloom like a fungus in the dark corners of his life, and he had watered it. He allowed it to grow because it served a purpose. It was the variable he needed to solve the equation of a marriage that had become a depreciating asset. Divorce is a messy, inefficient business, particularly in this state. It involves lawyers, depositions, the forensic accounting of assets, and the inevitable, humiliating division of wealth. Even with a prenuptial agreement, Claire would have been a nuisance. She would have fought for alimony. She would have sold her story to the tabloids. She would have tarnished the brand Richard had spent decades building. She was bored, she was ungrateful, and she had become an expensive liability. A dead wife, however, is a tragedy. A dead wife is a sympathy card played on the public stage, a narrative of loss that humanizes a titan of industry, and a dead wife who perishes in a tragic accident at sea, alongside the man she was sleeping with, that is a closed case. It was elegant. It was clean. It was the only solution that yielded a net profit. He had let them plan this escape because it saved him the trouble of arranging their disappearance himself. They had voluntarily walked into the trap, fueled by the delusion that they were the heroes of their own story, never realizing they were merely characters in the final act of his. He looked at the blue dot again. It was far enough out now. The depth charts indicated they were over deep water, miles from the nearest shipping lane or fishing vessel. The Siren was a magnificent boat, a masterpiece of Italian engineering that he had insured for an astronomical sum, double its actual value, thanks to a favor from an underwriter who owed him his career. It was a shame to destroy such a beautiful machine, but in business one must be willing to liquidate assets to clear debts. The technical malfunction he had arranged was not a frayed wire or a leaky valve. It was a military-grade explosive charge, no larger than a brick, magnetically attached to the bulkhead separating the fuel tanks from the engine room. He had installed it himself 3 weeks ago, During a solitary inspection of the vessel, it was wired to a secure, encrypted receiver that responded to a specific frequency, a frequency he controlled with the application currently open on his screen. There were no timers, no chances for them to find it and disarm it. There was only his will, waiting for the perfect moment to assert itself. He imagined them out there in the dark. He pictured Claire standing at the rail, the wind in her hair, laughing with the relief of escape, thinking she was finally free of his control. He pictured Dante at the helm, feeling the power of the engines, believing he had stolen the king's crown. They were likely celebrating, perhaps touching each other with that frantic, desperate energy they thought was love. He felt a flicker of contempt, not for their betrayal but for their stupidity. They had underestimated the reach of his ownership. They thought the ocean was a wilderness where his rules did not apply, but they failed to understand that he did not need to be present to enforce his will. He simply needed to make a decision. He looked at the digital button on the screen, a simple red circle labeled Arm, followed by a secondary command labeled Execute. It was sterile. It was bloodless. It was as simple as transferring funds between accounts. Richard placed his thumb over the screen. There was no hesitation, no cinematic moment of regret. He did not hate Claire. He did not hate Dante. He simply had no further use for them. They were a column in a ledger that needed to be balanced. He tapped the first button. The screen flashed a confirmation prompt. Confirm detonation sequence. He pressed yes. Then he pressed execute. The signal was sent, traveling at the speed of light through the network of towers and satellites, racing across the black water to the receiver on the boat. He waited. On the horizon, far out in the crushing darkness where the sea met the sky, a tiny pinprick of light appeared. It was silent from this distance, a brief, violent flare that looked like a new star being born and dying in the same second. It was a small, artificial sun that flashed orange and white, illuminating the clouds for a fraction of a heartbeat before being swallowed by the night. On his phone screen, the pulsing blue dot froze for a second, then blinked out of existence. Signal lost. The message appeared in gray letters against a black background. The siren was gone. The explosion would have ruptured the fuel tanks instantly, turning the fiberglass hull into shrapnel and incinerating everything on board before the water even rushed in. There would be no bodies to recover, no wreckage large enough to analyze. The ocean was deep and hungry, and it kept its secrets well. Claire and Dante had been vaporized. Their dreams and their deceit turned to ash and steam in the blink of an eye. The love that had dared to exist without his permission had been extinguished as easily as blowing out a candle. The problem was solved. The liability was removed. He locked the phone and slipped it into the pocket of his silk robe. A profound, quiet sense of relief washed over him, the satisfaction of a complex deal successfully closed. The tension that had been humming in the background of his life for months dissipated, leaving behind a clean, empty silence. He turned away from the balcony railing, turning his back on the dark ocean and the invisible grave he had just dug. He walked back into the living room, the temperature instantly adjusting to a comfortable 70 degrees as the glass doors slid shut behind him, sealing out the wind and the chaos. The apartment was warm, quiet, and impeccably orderly. He walked to the sideboard and poured himself another splash of cognac, admiring the way the light caught the amber liquid. Tomorrow the performance would begin. He would have to play the role of the devastated husband. He would have to make the frantic calls to the Coast Guard, reporting the boat missing. He would have to cry on camera, perhaps organize a search party, and accept the condolences of the city's elite. He mentally rehearsed the tremor in his voice, the slump of his shoulders, the look of shock. He was a good actor. He had been wearing a mask for so long that one more role would be effortless. But first there was one final administrative task to complete. He picked up the landline, the heavy receiver feeling solid and real in his hand, and dialed the private number of his insurance broker. It was late, but he would answer. He always answered for Richard. As the line began to ring, he took a sip of his drink and smiled into the empty room, ready to collect on his investment.